Some things about Marx's personal life, and I haven't known just when to insert these remarks, and so I'm going to insert them now more or less as preparatory to the lecture, and then we'll have a kind of a base to look back toward to understand, I think, some things about his thinking. You realize that what I'm trying to do is expound his total theory, and not to refute it point by point, but to deal with it as a great system of floating abstractions and to show what the significance of these floating abstractions are so far as voicing a kind of sense of life in our culture. And therefore I am not indulging in any attempt to refute Marx by tracing his views back to his personal life and saying his personal life was such and such, therefore he was wrong. But I'm going to inject these little details anyway for your delectation. Marx was the son of a pretty prosperous man who owned land and vineyards and who was really what we would today call a classical liberal in his point of view. Marx was one of, I think, 9 children, and his father sent him to the university expecting that he would act responsibly. And very soon thereafter comes the letter from his father: "Dear Carl, I can't find you anymore. You're changing your address so often. I know it's probably to avoid your creditors that you're changing your address. I wish you wouldn't get into duels, and I wish you would generally act more responsible about your studies and not always be carousing at night." Now, Marx, in his last year at the University of Berlin, he is known to have attended only 2 courses. He then submitted his doctoral dissertation to the University of Jena, which was well known as a diploma mill. He married Jenny von Westphalen of Westphalia. It actually means a noble woman who was directly descended from the chief family of the Scottish nobility, the Earls of Argyll. And her family had the silver, the crested silver of the Earls of Argyll, together with their coat of arms and all that. The expenses for the honeymoon were paid for by Marx's mother-in-law, and he took the big sum of money while he and Jenny were honeymooning, and in one place they stopped. He had all the money in a box, and he opened the box and told all the guests in the hotel they could just come in and help themselves to the money. So in this way all the money was depleted, and they returned impoverished. When Marx wrote with Engels the Communist Manifesto, the manifesto had in effect been drawn up in different form by the tiny society called the League of the Just in London. They'd moved there from Paris, a tiny society, and they wanted Marx and Engels to sort of polish it up. And actually what they did was to take the original copy and to wait till the last minute and then substitute a completely different copy of their own composition. So Engels wrote to Marx saying, "I have done it. I've played the terrible trick on Mosey." Mosey was the guy, M-O-S-I, who had given him the original manuscript. When Marx went to live in London, he lived under very impoverished conditions in a slum apartment on Dean Street in the theater district. You can still see it. There's an Italian restaurant below it. And very few rooms. He was living on money that he got mainly from Engels, which Engels was from the surplus value that Engels was sweating out of his employees, and Marx was buying mostly cigars, and his children actually began to starve. He lost 2 or 3 children by starvation or starvation-related diseases. And on one occasion, he had to pawn his coat in order to buy a coffin for one of his children. So Marx generally lived the life of a parasite all his life long. Perhaps the most interesting example of the parasitism is this. When Mrs. Marx was pregnant, she was far along in her pregnancy. Suddenly, they had a maid, by the way, even though they lived in this slum apartment. Suddenly the maid became pregnant too, Marx being the father. So Marx then dispatched a letter to Engels. I just ran across this myself by accident before I saw any mention of it in secondary sources. There's a collected correspondence between them. To Friedrich Engels, who was his source of support. You see, Marx was afraid that his wife would be angry. So the letter goes like this. Dear Fred, I have news for you about yourself. Get it? He wanted Engels to assume the paternity of the child, so that Mrs. Marx wouldn't be angry. A clear case of a socialist not wanting credit for his physical productivity. The child, Engels assumed, obediently assumed the responsibility. And the child, Freddie Demuth, his name was, D-E-M-U-T-H, Freddie Demuth, was born and adopted by a working-class family and brought up as Engels' son. He thought apparently all his life that Engels was his father, and Engels insisted on correcting the point on his deathbed when he told Marx's daughter that it was really Marx who was the father of Freddie. Marx and his wife inherited some money finally from his wife's family, and they moved to better quarters. But even so, they were in trouble, and he kept pawning the silver of the the Earls of Argyll. And getting them back again. He had to pawn his coat sometimes. Meanwhile, he was European correspondent for the New York Tribune. I should mention that fact as well. And he was trying to raise a little bit of money that way. And finally, they came into a spot of money, and they gave a formal ball with liveried servants. Believe it or not, they blew it all. Just like that. So they were always bouncing back and forth between an extremely impoverished life and a life of assumed aristocratic tastes. Well, I'm going to come back to the significance of some of these things later on. I'm going to begin the lecture now. So you won't... I'm saying I'm beginning the lecture now so you won't say that the material was out of context. Now... At the end of the Middle Ages, feudalism, of course, came to its own end, and the conditions arrived which made the emergence of capitalism possible. The new geographical discoveries, according to Marx, now this is Marx's account, the new geographical discoveries opened up distant markets and caused the demand for commodities to rise. At the very moment of the rise in demand, new material forces of production arrived on the scene. There were owners of capital and owners of labor power. The owners of labor power were dispossessed peasants driven off their lands by the enclosure movement. by the suppression of the monasteries and so on. And so, therefore, armies of vagabonds were let loose. Enraged, they took to becoming thieves and highwaymen. Their deeds were answered by whipping them into the wage system by bloody and horrible legislation against vagabondage. You see, he's trying to establish capitalism really started by force. This total process he calls the expropriation of the many and the enrichment of the few. Two classes of commodity possessors now faced each other. The owners of capital, that is the instruments of production and money capital, eager to hire wage labor, and the owners of labor power, eager to sell it for a wage. These are the fundamental conditions of capitalism. Factories and instruments of production is one commodity, labor power is another commodity. Now, one of capitalism's distinguishing marks, according to Marx, one of its distinguishing marks, setting it off from slavery and feudalism, is that the worker is now, quote, free, unquote. You see, the slave doesn't make a contract with his slave owner, nor does the serf make a contract with the landowner. But the worker makes a contract with the employer. But to use Hegelian language again, this freedom is only an appearance, and you've got to penetrate below into the essence to see what is really going on. When you penetrate below into the essence, you will see that the worker is actually forced, physically forced. How so? Because if he does not accept the wage contract, he starves. His legal freedom, therefore, consists in the freedom to starve if he does not accept the wage contract. This control over the worker is exercised by the employer because of the employer's antecedent accumulation of capital, which puts one party to the wage contract to such a disadvantage that he's faced with an offer that he cannot refuse. Now, I'm coming to the second topic up on the board there, the aim of Marx's economic theory. It's designed to prove four things. One, that although on the surface capitalism appears to be based on free relations among men, it is really a form of oppression. Secondly, that although on the surface it seems to be liberating, it is really alienating. Everybody got that now? Shall I repeat? I repeat the two of them. Capitalism, there are four bad... Marxist theory is intended to prove four basic things about capitalism. First, that although on the surface it appears to be based on free relations among men, it is really a form of oppression. Secondly, that although on the surface it seems to be liberating, it is really alienating. That's just what the Soviets say about our system now, you see, the so-called free countries. Thirdly, that it is nevertheless the most productive form of economic organization that has yet appeared. See, he says that in the Communist Manifesto. It is nevertheless the most productive form of economic organization that has yet appeared. Fourth, that it contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. It will, therefore, finally break down because of conflicts built into its very nature. Now I'm going to be dealing largely with some basic theses set forth in the first volume of Das Kapital for a few minutes. He makes a distinction between product and commodity. Product is anything produced by man. A commodity is produced in order to sell or to barter. All commodities have to combine use value with exchange value. They have to have some use, but then there is the exchange value they have, which is the capacity to command other products in exchange. The analysis of use value is simple. It is the way in which a product satisfies a need or desire, and it is demonstrable in terms of its natural properties. For instance, this cup, you say, has certain natural properties which permit it to hold water. If it did not have the natural properties, no one would ever buy it as a cup, at least. Exchange value is, however, a more complicated concept. The exchange value of a commodity is the proportion in which it exchanges with other commodities. You see so many cups for so many sweaters, for so many lipsticks or something like that, for so many compasses, for so many brain surgeons, necessary instruments, and so on, for so many copies of Das Kapital. The exchange value, therefore, is the proportion in which it exchanges for other commodities. This is a quantitative relation. So much iron is exchanged for so much corn. On the average, and barring special circumstances, commodities of one type will exchange for commodities of another type in a definite proportion. If so, there must be something about the one which can be compared with something about the other, and compared quantitatively. The two commodities, in other words, must be commensurable, co-measurable with respect to a certain property. This property cannot be a natural property, like the whiteness of the cup or the geometrical shape of the cup, for it is not geometrical, it is not physical, it is not chemical. There's only one property left over, and this is the labor that went into producing the commodity. To clarify the method of his argument, Marx uses the illustration that we compare areas of rectangles by decomposing them into triangles, and then expressing the areas of triangles by half the product of the base into the altitude. Marx's point is that in comparing the areas of geometrical figures, we abstract from their visual appearance and reduce them to underlying quantitative relations. So in the same way, the price or exchange value of a commodity is a mere, quote, mere market appearance, unquote, that is intelligible only in terms of an underlying essence, which Marx calls real value, or simply value with a capital V. This underlying value must bear to the actual price at least a rough relation, such as the geometrical equation bears to the visual appearance of the geometrical shape. Now, what relation can this be? It must be something like rough variation in direct proportion. But Marx tells us we must be very careful in our use of the term labor. We don't mean any one type of labor, like the labor of a watchmaker or a weaver. We don't mean any concrete bit of labor, because you can't compare the labor of the watchmaker with the labor of the weaver. We do not mean concrete labor. We must mean abstract labor, a concept which leaves out the qualitative differences between weaving and watchmaking, you see, but retains the quantitative differences. Now, in terms of what dimension can all labor from weaving to watchmaking be measured quantitatively, do you suppose? Hours, time, yes. There's your quantitative relation. Obviously, says Marx, duration. More duration, more labor, more value. Now, this does not mean, he immediately qualifies in the first few pages of Capital, this does not mean that by slowing up you can increase the value of your product. The labor time to which Marx is referring is what he calls, and this is a very vital phrase in his whole theory, quote, socially necessary labor time, unquote. Socially necessary labor time, unquote. And I'm here making a short quote from Marx himself. Quote, the labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time, taking into account all the machines and everything like that, unquote. If the prevailing conditions of production are those of the handloom, my labor time will approach the average in value, and my products exchange accordingly. But let everyone else get a power loom, and let me continue to produce on my hand loom. I may work for 1 full hour, but the work I put in is worth only half an hour of socially necessary labor. I will have half as many lengths of cloth to exchange. This holds as long as I compare the lengths of cloth I produce with the lengths of cloth produced by everyone else. But meanwhile, the introduction of the power loom would reduce the value of lengths of cloth in general compared to the value of the commodities in whose production a similar technological improvement did not occur. Quote, the value of a commodity varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productiveness of the labor incorporated in it. Well, you may ask, what about skilled labor? Remember, with the business of the brain surgeon and the possibility of doing your own brain surgery? What about skilled labor? Is that no more valuable than unskilled labor performed in the same amount of time under the same conditions? You know the story about the surgeon who presented a brain surgeon who presented a bill of $1,000 to the patient, and the patient said, "What, $1,000 for simply making a little slit in the brain?" And he said, $1 for making the slit, $999 for knowing where to make it. So, no, that's the problem. You see, what about skilled labor? Is that no more valuable than unskilled labor performed in the same amount of time under the same conditions? Do we measure all labor in time from broom pushing to brain surgery? Marx's solution, in quotes, is as follows. Quote, skilled labor counts only as multiplied simple labor. It's, unquote, it's almost as if you thought of a carpenter sort of sawing your brain for a long time, and you measured that against the skilled labor performed by the instrument. A given quantity of skilled labor being considered equal to a greater quantity, a given quantity of skilled labor being considered equal to a greater quantity of simple labor. The different proportions in which different sorts of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their standard are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers and consequently appears to be fixed by custom. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled, simple labor, unquote. Okay? Thus, in the attempt to discover what it is that governs the relative prices of commodities, Marx hits upon the solution that the standard is what the least skilled man will give up, everything else being ranked as a multiple of this. What he gives up is time doing what he doesn't want to do. Well, he gives up time doing what he really wants to do, and instead he does what he doesn't want to do, labor time. This has been the typical tribute to reality paid daily by the average man. Products have always been distributed one way or another in society. Now, this is an important point. Products have always been distributed one way or another in society. But in primitive society, they have been distributed in terms of their use values alone. Production in primitive society was for use. Ever since the breakup of primitive society, products have been distributed as commodities, that is, in terms of their exchange value. This exchange value has varied. It is varied directly with the average unskilled labor time embodied in them. And therefore, in a commodity exchange, a society arranges for a certain pattern of distribution. In each state of society, this law of value, as Marx calls it, will have a different form, governed by the social relations of production, and the science of economics consists in working out how the law of value operates in each case. Now, we've seen that commodities have a tendency to exchange according to the unskilled, average, socially necessary labor they embody. Even so, there is something unnatural about a commodity produced for exchange and not for use. Where do you suppose Marx got that doctrine? That there's something sort of, it's a kind of a, as Archie Bunker would call it, a preversion to produce for commodity exchange rather than for use. Where do you suppose that doctrine came from? No? Aristotle. Aristotle, Politics, Book 1, Chapter 9. Quote, of everything that we possess there are two uses. One is the proper use and the other the improper use. For example, a shoe is used for wear, that's the proper use, and it is used for exchange, that is the improper use. He who gives a shoe in exchange for money or food to him who wants one does indeed use the shoe as a shoe, but this is not its proper use, for a shoe is not made to be an object of barter. A shoe is not made to be an object of barter, unquote. And it was largely on the basis of this that Aristotle formulated his famous doctrine that when you lend money at interest, that is something unnatural, because it's not like lending a cow where the cow can produce some calves. You see, the money doesn't really do anything. It just sits there. Now, just why Aristotle thought that is something which perhaps we can come back to later. Marx maintains that exchange value is unnatural because, unlike use value, it does not reside in the natural properties of the thing, like geometrical properties or physical properties, but it resides in the social relations of production. At the simplest level, you and I have put the same amount of labor time into hunting for two animals like a deer and a beaver. He got this example from Adam Smith. Therefore, it would be a fair exchange. Even in such a non-exploitative exchange, you see, we have risen above the perceptual level and are thinking, but we're thinking subjectively because property relations have been established. We're thinking subjectively about social relations between men. That is, you own it, I don't own it, I work for you, you own the instruments of production, and so on. So that now value, economic value, assumes, quote, the fantastic form of a relation between things, unquote. There's no real relation between the shoe and the bread, but it's just some fantasy that we have in our head. You see, we're above the perceptual level because we're in fantasy now. Now, commodities, because their relation to each other and to men is on the conceptual level, Marx compares to religious objects, and that's why he speaks of the fetishism of commodities, because in our thinking we have risen above the perceptual level. Now, in capitalist society, exchange value is treated as a real attribute of products. Virtually all production is for exchange, and virtually everybody engages in exchange. When products are generally produced for exchange, the value relations between them become established. So many meters of linen for so many grams of gold, and so on. Finally, the relative value magnitudes become fixed. Any commodity has a value relation to each of the others. If this commodity is used to express the value of all the others, it becomes money. And if it can be recognized universally, it becomes the supreme power among commodities, the supreme fetish. Now, I'm going to say a few words about the larger philosophical significance of all this, still penetrating, I hope, more deeply into the significance of the labor theory of value. I believe it lies in this. Marx believed that all commodity production imposed a sacrifice, and that this sacrifice ultimately came down to labor under alienating conditions. Men sought to avoid this sacrifice by seizing control of the means of production and forcing others to work for them. They didn't want to work with their hands, you see. The ensuing property relations of production resulted in each society in a characteristic distribution of goods which could be expressed in terms of the prices at which they exchanged. But all the prices originally came down to labor, the original sweat. Capitalism was the most sensational and efficient method of avoiding sweat, which is what exploitation is. Capitalism is the most sensational and efficient method of exploitation because it led to an ever greater creation of extra value, or what we will call surplus value. But the allocation of all value under capitalism was chaotic because it was based on individual decisions rather than on centralized rational planning. And this led capitalism into deeper and deeper crises. You see, Marx thinks that when we come to commodity production, we have to be rational. But since it is not a basic property of the individual to be rational, the individual, when he goes about trying to buy and sell, will naturally act irrationally. And so you will have all these little, you and I, we're the centers of irrationality, exchanging at all these irrational values. But since only society as a whole can think rationally, we need to establish a centralized economic plan which will be worked out by some social power. You see? So that this again comes back to the concept of species being, that man is rational only as a species, only collectively and not as an individual. Individual decisions, therefore, are chaotic. They cannot be truly rational because thinking at the individual level is some sort of fantasy about fetishes. A bigger car, a bigger house, a bigger swimming pool, or something like that. Now, to understand what capitalism is, let us, by way of contrast, look at the simple self-employed manufacturer in some pre-capitalist economy. Say that he is a potter. He owns the means of production, his potter's wheel, and his raw material. He produces pots, a commodity which we will call C, capital C now. In order to get money, M, he wants the money in order to buy commodities like food, so that under pre-capitalist conditions, the direction of exchange is CMC. He enters the market with his commodity, he gets paid, and he buys something else. By contrast, the capitalist enters the market with money. He uses the money as a factor in the production of commodities and then sells the commodities for more money than he has invested. This whole process can be expressed by money, creation of commodities, M prime gets more money out of it. The difference between M and M prime is what Marx calls surplus value. The original money that is used to generate more money is known as capital. Surplus value, he thinks, takes three basic forms. I'm going to run over this very quickly. It's necessary for clarification. Interest, rent, and profit. This came from the classical economists. The interest goes to the banker, the rent goes for land and equipment. What remains is profit, or unowed surplus value. So therefore, M prime is M prime minus interest plus rent plus any other expenses equals M2. M2 is what happens after the capitalist has paid his debt out of M prime. M2 is his profit, right? M2 is his profit. If M2 is greater than M, capital has accumulated. When invested, the new capital accumulates further surplus value. The defining goal of capitalism is the accumulation of ever greater surplus value. Profits are generated from production in capitalism. The capitalist does not simply resell the commodities he's bought. There must be one commodity that he has bought that generates surplus value. And this commodity is labor power, Arbeitskraft, labor power. The set of capabilities that a human being has whom he employs. If money is a super or supreme commodity, labor power is the commodity beyond which no other commodity can be conceived. For it is only by purchasing labor power that money can act as capital, and it is only by the use of labor power already bought for a wage that capital can be accumulated. Now, exploitation exists in all societies above the primitive level. It is not confined to capitalism. See, the slave has his labor exploited. The master takes everything the slave produces, and then the slave gets his board and room or his bread and water or something like that. And likewise, the feudal serf works Monday and Tuesday for himself, and then all the other days of the week he gives surplus value to the Lord. But exploitation in the pre-capitalist societies all differ profoundly from the capitalist mode of exploitation. First, in the pre-capitalist societies, use values still predominate over exchange values. Therefore, quote, surplus labor will be limited by a given set of wants. The slave owner is not going to drive that slave too far. And so there was no tendency to work the Greek slave or the medieval serf to death, with one exception, the gold and silver mines, where the object was precisely to produce exchange value and not use value. However, under capitalism, there is by definition a thirst for creating more and more surplus value. Greed. Now, Marx, this is the actual term used by Marx in Das Kapital. Money bags is driven by thirst for surplus value. Therefore, he works his employees as far as he can short of killing them, unlike the slave owner. See, this is why capitalism is, in a way, worse than slavery. How much of a way depends on whether you're an employer or a worker. Capitalism is worse than its predecessors. However, it's also better in another sense, in that by creating a greater social product and a greater efficiency in production, it adds to the possibilities, it adds to the comforts of life for us all. Now, here's a contradiction. The contradiction between the efficiency of capitalism and its cruel slavery, which must be solved dialectically. And how do we solve things dialectically? We solve them by force on the field of history, not by argument. Now, there's another contrast. In pre-capitalist societies, the relation between servant and master is established by naked force. Then it's worked out in social rules, rules of status, defining mutual obligations. As a serf or as a slave, you always know where you stand and how much of your labor is being appropriated by the master. Also, the master has social obligations to the serf or slave to look out for his health or his old age. Holy days and saints' days abound. Everyone gets off work on holy days, regardless of economic considerations. In capitalism, on the other hand, we have a society not of status but of contract. Both parties are theoretically, legally equal. The worker sells his labor power at so much per hour. The employer directs the use of the labor power as he will. After the whistle blows, the worker is, quote, his own boss, unquote. As for the employer, he has no obligation to the worker. He would be glad to take away all holy days if he could. Bah, humbug. You see now where Dickens was coming from. He had the pre-capitalist orientation. In the wage transaction, the capitalist does not buy the labor of the worker. If he did, his offer would go like this. Here is some wood and some phosphorus. Fashion these raw materials into so many matches, and I will give you $8. Now, under what conditions would this contract be just? Well, just means equal. If $8 is equal to the value added by the labor, then $8 is what the capitalist justly owes to the worker. However, no capitalist would be stupid enough to make such a contract, for he would make no profit. A capitalist, therefore, does not contract for labor. Instead, he contracts for labor power, Arbeitskraft. He makes the following offer to the worker, quote, I wish to buy your labor power for 8 hours. I will employ it as I wish. In return, I will give you $8. Why $8? Because $8 will purchase the food, the clothing, and the shelter necessary to keep the worker alive, keep him at subsistence level. It is enough to reproduce the same labor power the following day. It represents the congealed labor in that food, clothing, and shelter, and as such it is the true value of the labor power, the market value of the labor power. The worker then accepts the capitalist's offer and he goes to work. After 4 hours, he notices he has added to the raw materials enough value to equal the amount of money necessary for his daily sustenance. He is ready to pick up his check and go home. But strangely, the whistle does not blow. The capitalist explains to him, look, fellow, I bought your labor power to employ for 8 hours. That is why I am called an employer. It is the right to employ that I bought, not a specific amount of value to be added by your labor. In return for the hire of your labor power, I am giving you a price sufficient to be ready for work tomorrow, when we can start again. Unquote. Now, on whose side is Marx in this dispute? Well, Marx says that on the issue of justice, he is on the side of the employer. What the capitalist does to the worker, Marx says, is, quote, nicht ein Unrecht, not an injustice, unquote. Had he refused to pay him at all, or had he paid him at less than a subsistence level, that would have been an injustice in this narrow sense of injustice. What is just and what is not just is, from the standpoint of Marxist philosophy, always determined by the social relations of production existing in a given society. Now, does not Marx then denounce capitalism morally? Does he not again and again call it robbery? The answer is quite revealing. Marx says this in one sentence. The capitalist, quote, does not merely rob, but he earns the surplus value with full right. That is the right corresponding to this mode of production, unquote. Now, when Marx is calling the capitalists robbers, he's not denouncing them as performing an injustice in the ordinary accepted sense of injustice. The truth is that Marx believes that robbery is a regular social relation of production determined by the stage of development of the productive powers at the time. For Marx, force in human relations is quite normal and quite natural. Capitalism is just the cleverest form of robbery that has yet come along, and it's so exceedingly clever because it's disguised. Well, then, isn't Marx against capitalism? Isn't he always denouncing it? Yes, but not on grounds of formal ethics as unjust, rather on the metaphysical grounds that it is alienating. Now, of course, the way in which Marxism is ordinarily presented, and was ordinarily presented in his popular works by Marx and others, involved a shifting of ground. They propagandized and they appealed to commonly accepted standards of justice. Now I'm going on to the fatal contradictions in capitalism. Capitalism generates its own destruction. It's based on three fatal contradictions. Three fatal contradictions. One, the ever-expanding development of the forces of production calls for a policy of conscious, collectively planned production for use for the benefit of society as a whole. Because the forces of production are expanding, we need a more rational mode of organizing our property relations. But this is incompatible with production for exchange and for private gain. That's the first fatal contradiction. The second fatal contradiction is that capitalism's productive forces call more and more for socialized production. No longer are there individual craftsmen working in their cottages, only workers on the assembly line. The raising of capital itself has become collectivized and its use centralized in large corporations. Thus, the material forces of production now in capitalist society are collectivistic, but the property relations are private. And this private property concept, Marx thinks, has come down from feudalism. So it's a leftover, it's a remnant of feudalism, and it comes into contact with collectivistic material modes of production. The essence of capitalism is therefore a mixture of collectivism and feudalism, and they are in contradiction to each other. The social relations of production remain private, therefore control of production and the appropriation of profits remain private. Third basic contradiction. Now get this, this is very important. Between the organization in the factory and the organization of outside society, there is a contradiction. Within the factory, there is centralized planning of a systematic, almost Prussian military order. Marx admires this, you see, this Prussian organization. But outside, in society, there's the chaos of the stock exchange. Oh, I forgot to tell you before that Marx was taking the money Engels was giving him, and instead of spending it on foods for his kids, he was speculating on the New York Stock Exchange, as well as buying cigars. Outside in society, there is no planned apportionment of resources to meet social needs, nor is there any orderly relation between firms, such as you get, Dr. Shenfield pointed out, during wartime. Each capitalist produces what he chooses. He makes this individual, irrational decision, you see, and then he embarks on a mad search for markets. Chaos reigns. It is the Hobbesian war of all against all. Every man is a wolf to every man. Dog eat dog. Now, these individualistic social relations, now he's going to make a concession. You see, he's got all these contradictions and he's rolling them around. Imagine him explaining it to Engels now. These individualistic social relations, Fred, they did energize the forces of production, but in time the latent contradictions revealed themselves. Now the three contradictions we have just summarized generate three fatal diseases that will inevitably bring capitalism to its death. The falling rate of profit, the misery of the workers, and the ever-deepening periodic crises. Now, I assume that I'm not going to go into this in any detail, except to mention the misery of the workers. Due to their relations, the misery of the workers comes due to their relation to the machines. The lengthening of the working day, the latter is caused not only by the employer's attempt to extract extra surplus value, but due to his awareness that idle machines detract from his profit and undergo depreciation. So he tries to keep edging up on the working day. New machinery causes unemployment. Under capitalism, the machine is the enemy of the worker. Now, furthermore, Marx thought that some of the time there's going to be a tendency toward the absolute impoverishment of the worker. The condition of the worker is growing worse and worse as capitalism proceeds. But all the empirical facts went against this. And Marx changed his tune as time went on, and he talked, therefore, of the relative impoverishment of the workers. He says that the time comes when the worker gets richer, and he builds a nice little mansion. But his employer shoots up a palace right next to it. And this agonizes him, it makes him sick, and he sues for psychological damages, you see, because of this. So this relative impoverishment of the workers is another fundamental aspect of capitalism. Now, since I have a few minutes left, I'm going to start on the concept of revolution. Marx believes that revolution is the only means by which change can come about. Marx approached revolution first from the standpoint of Hegelian philosophy. A revolution means a change that is radical and that occurs over a relatively short time. The revolution occurs as the result of tensions, which Hegel and Marx call contradictions, tensions which slowly accumulate over a much longer period of time. The accumulation of tensions is incremental and quantitative. Like if I start pushing that sweater, you see, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's accumulating quantitatively. Then comes the revolution. A sudden qualitative change appears. The maid is pregnant or something like that. An example of such a revolutionary change in the field of nature is the freezing of water. At 10 degrees centigrade, water has the quality of being liquid. Then the temperature is lowered by quantitative increments. Hotness and coldness contradict and struggle with one another. The coldness gradually increasing. Suddenly there is a radical change and we have a new state of matter, ice. Natural change is thus of two kinds, quantitative change and qualitative change. Revolution is a qualitative change. Prior to the revolution, there's a struggle between contradictory historical forces, and then there's incremental change, and then a sudden revolution, and we have a new form of society. Well, within our present society, there are contradictory elements between the material forces of production and the social relations of production. As we have said, the material forces of production are collectivistic, but the social relations are individualistic. The capitalists have gathered many men and machines together in gigantic manufacturing plants. This produces a greater and greater collectivistic consciousness or class solidarity among the workers who are looking back and forth and saying, it's us against them, here comes the speed up, and so forth and so on. And so you see, under capitalism, you have this change to a greater and greater collectivism. Now, even so, the workers don't quite get it. I mean, they get together collectively for such paltry things as rises in wages and shorter hours and so forth. But come middle-class intellectuals into the situation, alienated middle-class intellectuals like Marx, and he can, quote, raise their consciousness, unquote. That's a basic Marxist phrase, to raise their consciousness, to show them how they ought not to just strike for higher wages or something like that, but they should change the whole thing. Now, the social relations of production, as I said, are individualistic. They are inherited from a pre-capitalistic age in which the means of production were individually owned and worked. Capitalism, therefore, for Marx, is a contradictory system whose very nature requires that it be collectively owned and therefore transformed into socialism. The result of this contradiction is a revolution, resulting in a society whose means of production are collective in nature and collectively owned. This is socialism. Socialism is the politico-economic system uniquely suited to the industrial age. It will be succeeded by another higher system, which eventually came to be called communism, which in its turn will be uniquely suited to the still more productive society brought about by socialism. Well, what about the actual details of the revolution? First, the situation must ripen by the accumulation of contradictions in capitalism until they finally explode in a great economic crisis. Secondly, comes the revolution. It must be by a seizure of political power. Some revolutions in the past were not characterized by a seizure of political power. For instance, the transition from slavery to feudalism. But in such cases, old forms had broken down and new ones took their place. But when governments are strong and efficient, like nowadays in the 19th century, seizure must take place. An example is the capitalist revolution against the absolute monarchies. Here a new class, the bourgeoisie, a historically anointed class, the Messiah, you say, the social Messiah, rose in revolution and in wave after wave overcame the absolute monarchs. In the glorious Revolution of 1688 in England, in the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. How did the bourgeoisie ever manage this? They were motivated by their own selfish interests, but also they were serving as agents for everybody who felt oppressed by the old order, the peasants and the city proletariat. The bourgeoisie were to a degree a universal class, a stand-in for all humanity. They established liberal democracy, but then they used liberal democracy as a screen to oppress the other classes, especially the proletariat. Now the hour of the proletariat has struck. The proletariat are completely impoverished by capitalism. They have nothing to lose. It is therefore in their selfish interest to rise in revolution. But the proletariat are the most collectivistic of all classes. They want a society without classes. Their thrust is toward economic equality, not just legal equality, as was the case with the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is, in a sense, the collective counterpart of Hegel's hero in history, whom the cunning of reason has chosen to bring about great historical change for his own selfish interests, to be sure, but on a deeper level for reason's own reasons. As Marx sees it, the proletariat acts for all mankind to bring about the classless society, and the proletariat thus liquidates itself. By what means will the revolution be brought about? Basically, Marx and Engels had two scenarios. That the proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in a certain country. The first scenario involved a forceful seizure of power, setting aside the existing legal processes. The second scenario applied to countries whose institutions, customs, and traditions were like England and the United States, where if the working class were to gain a majority in Parliament or Congress, then it could, I'm quoting from Marx now, it could by legal means set aside the laws and structures that stood in its way. Of course, such a development, quoting from Marx again, can only remain peaceful as long as it is not opposed by the violence of those who wield power in society at that time. Addressing the governments of the world, he said, "You are the armed power that is directed against the proletariat. We will proceed against you by peaceful means, where that is possible, and with arms when it is necessary. It is quite clear that whichever scenario occurs, there will be a forcible seizure of the instruments of production remaining in private hands. This will be done by the government that is now being run by the proletariat. In Marx's words, quote, the expropriators will be expropriated, unquote. Any resistance in the name of allegedly inalienable rights will be labeled counter-revolutionary and suppressed by violence, by a full reign of terror if necessary. The revolution, then, consists of the proletariats gaining control by whatever means of the state apparatus, confiscating and nationalizing the means of production, and putting down by force any resistance." Thank you. Any questions? Bob?
Yes, I have a question about Aristotle's idea about shoes are to be worn, but not to be used for barter. He made a comment that there was some reason for his taking this particular position. Can you make a comment on it?
Yes. Aristotle, in his time...
I think I had a question.
Yes, I think I better repeat the question. Why did Aristotle regard production for exchange as unnatural, whereas he regarded production for use as natural? I think the reason was that Aristotle simply could not conceive a great social system with highly abstract interrelations. That is to say, he was actually operating closer to the perceptual level in the atmosphere of the Greek city-state, and therefore he did not actually think this thing out when he said that when he said that money lent it does not do anything. He didn't see the possibility of money actually producing more money the way a cow will produce calves. And Aristotle's thought was simply not far-ranging enough at this point. And I think this is generally true of his political thought. That's why we have the very term politics. It comes from polis, the small community or city-state. And that's why Aristotle's political and also his ethical thought is, in my opinion, so inferior to the basic foundations which he laid down in his logic, his epistemology, and his metaphysics. He didn't apply his own principles. He just sort of started all over again within the social context in which he lived. That help? No? Yes. This gentleman.
What was the basis that Marx provided for the transition from the feudal society to the capitalist society?
Yes, what was the basis which Marx provided for the transition from the feudal society to the capitalist society? He mentioned many different factors, one of which was the discovery of new wealth in the Indies and in America. Another of which was the enclosure system, by which common land was enclosed in order to raise sheep for the new sheep industry. Therefore, what he was trying to do was to show that capitalism started by force. That is, the original accumulation of capitalism was not by the industrious, abstinent saver, so to speak, but by one man robbing another. Now, I don't know all the details of economic history, or I'm unable to answer this in any great detail, such as a trained economic historian would be. But it is, of course, true that it's true almost by definition that the accumulation of capital preceding capitalism would have to be by non-capitalistic methods. You see? I mean, that's the way they were doing things then. And so this is one part of the answer that I would certainly give to Marx, that capitalism just had to start at a certain point. But that didn't mean, of course, that saving and all the rest didn't come into operation at the same time. Yes?
With regard to Marx's later period guidance, he states that the skilled labor is worth a multiple or more than the unskilled labor due to the fact that why is that? Is that because of past labor they put in learning these skills?
Well, it's like a vacuum cleaner, or say a robot vacuum cleaner compared to a janitor pushing a broom. The robot vacuum cleaner will add within a very short time to the situation what the janitor would take a long time to add, and he thinks that everything can be measured in that way. The more complex can be reduced to what he thinks is the more simple. Now, obviously, if you try to apply that to brain surgery, you'd see that before the skill you didn't have anything at all. You didn't have just carpenters sawing people's skulls. And then later on, we got brain surgeons. I mean, this is, in my opinion, an absurd theory. It's what Ayn Rand called muscle mysticism. Muscle mysticism, saying that all true labor is unskilled labor. He wanted to reduce it to a common denominator, ultimately sweat and discomfort. And indeed, some capitalist thinkers have likewise treated the nature of labor. Marx is not the only one who did this. Yes?
One of the contradictions in capitalism was you said that production forces become collective.
The productive, you're asking, the question is, what did I mean when I said that under capitalism the productive forces have become collectivized? Formerly, craftsmen, according to Marx, used to work by themselves, spinning in their little cottages, you see. They were in their homes. Then along comes the capitalist, and he builds this big shed called a factory, and he brings them all together. And he adds the machines and so forth and so on. So now, it's not a matter of one craftsman having to walk 10 miles to consult with the other craftsman about getting together and forcing a rise in wages. They can talk to each other at the machines around the assembly line, so that the actual forces of production become collectivized, and this in turn creates a kind of class consciousness, a collectivized class consciousness on the part of the workers. This gentleman.
Do you know how Marx worked personally? Did he have a systematic plan of action for his writings? Or did he just have to put out another tract every time he pawned his coat?
He wrote and he wrote and he wrote. Sometimes the question is, how did Marx write? Did he have a plan for his writing? Was he goal-directed? Did he systematize his writing? Well, I'll just have to tell you how unsystematic he was and how badly he conceived his goals and the length of time that it would take to gain them. It took him decades to produce the whole of Das Kapital. When he told his friends about it, how fast he would write Das Kapital, he said, quote, "I'll have all this economic shit written in 5 weeks," unquote. Perhaps that's good answer. Yes.
Do I understand from what you said that he conceded eventually? Was there a change? He conceded eventually that capitalism worked to make the workers richer. But the problem was envy. The problem was that some people actually got real rich, and that was the default. Did he concede that the workers, at the end, the workers actually got better off, which should have been fine, but the real problem was envy?
Did Marx concede that the workers get better off? Absolutely. Did he concede that? Eventually, he came to concede that. At first, he had other theories. Did he see that envy was a bad thing? What Marxist would ever regard envy as a vice? No. He saw the envy as being justified because he had an egalitarian standard of value operating in the back of his mind. He had the concept of the unearned as his basic standard of value. You should get what you need, not what you earn. John.
Could you comment on the style of Marxian polemics, the one adopted too by Trotsky, Lenin, Stalin, all of them? What I mean is like the use of derogatory terms like dogs of capitalism.
Could I comment on the present Marxist-Leninist use of terms like dogs of capitalism in contrast to what?
The style that was started by Marx, the style of polemics.
It was abusive. Well, my comments would become increasingly abusive as I elaborated. Professor Reisman.
I'd like to know where does Marx concede that capitalism actually raises the average standard of living? Because isn't that the main issue between the orthodox Marxists and the revisionists?
Later on, where did Marx say this? Now, the answer is I can't give you a citation right off, but I think that in one of his letters he said this, but he never developed it. It's built into his theory, and it was Edward Bernstein, the great revisionist thinker, that later said Marx was systematically wrong about this. And perhaps you'd like, I didn't go into the whole business of the army of the unemployed, the reserve army of the unemployed, unfortunately, which is of some importance.
Published ideas.
No, it was never part of Marx's published ideas, but he did say either they are absolutely impoverished or they are relatively impoverished. He did say that in Capital, that the mansion of the worker goes up, and beside it there shoots up the palace of the employer, and say that was another example of the impoverishment of the worker.
My reading of Marx is he's talking about absolute impoverishment, and implying that if the capitalists could, they not only lengthen the working day, but could substitute potatoes for wheat bread.
Oh, there's no doubt but your reading of it is that he had no doctrine of relative impoverishment, which he ever published. Do I understand you correctly?
Well, maybe that's a true adding, but the main thrust is absolute impoverishment.
Absolute. That's right. The main thrust is absolute impoverishment. That's correct. Perhaps I didn't emphasize that strongly enough. The other one is just a kind of afterthought, which later the revisionists made the real thing. Yes, sir.
Which is the most influential, prominent modern Marxist doctrine? The idea that the poor actually get poorer, or that they're relatively impoverished psychologically?
Well, in the advanced industrial countries, you have the fat, corrupted worker, you say, who has been bribed by shorter hours and better working conditions and so on. But meanwhile, the capitalists have moved out their operations into countries which have no minimum wage laws and so forth and so on. And the real terrible oppression is going on there. Would that answer the question?
Now, which of these two viewpoints that you and Dr. Reason were discussing, the absolute empowerment and the relative, is the most influential view espoused by Marxists today?
Well, with respect to again, I would have to answer, the most influential view espoused by Marxists today is absolute impoverishment for the third world countries. But they don't, obviously they can't go around talking about this in New York City. Yes?
You said that Marx's view was that the surplus value, the profit of the businessman was by exploiting the workers. If the businessman had a loss, were the workers exploiting him?
The question is, if the businessman had a loss, would the workers be exploiting him? According to Marx, it is the job of the capitalist under capitalism to accumulate as much surplus value as possible, according to a complex form which he called the organic composition of capital, which I can't get into, but by which he tries to get as much out of the worker as possible rather than out of the constant capital which he puts in rather than the wages. So that it is the employer's fault if anything goes wrong. It's certainly not the worker's fault. If the employer is not making enough and he goes out of business, that's his problem. He just hasn't exploited them enough, Marx says. He hasn't been evil enough. And this is one of the reasons why we have to change over to socialism. Let me see if I can. Yes.
Would you go over again that relationship between the private property complex and social planning in the second of the federal constitution?
Well, we have a more productive economic system. Strangely enough, in order to make it work right, we have to make the property ownership system as collective as the factory management system. We've got to make it Prussian, in other words, and orderly. You see, inside the factory all is order. Outside the factory all is chaos. Firm competes against firm. We've got to stop having these firms competing against firms and have Prussian order all over the place. Yes?
How would you account for the value of certain things that might not require a lot of labor, yet they'll have value, such as furs or vintage wine?
Professor Eastman, can you perhaps you know something about this? What about the value of diamonds and furs and things that you come on accidentally and do not add your labor to?
I think a general explanation for that could be that he's talking about the average case, what we call socially necessary labor, not where you pick up a diamond accidentally with no labor, but usually to get that diamond, people have to be laboring thousands of hours in the mine, and that would be the average that determines it. But there are cases where he just has no answer. How can he explain the value of land? He can't. How does he explain why skilled labor is more valuable than unskilled labor? He really has no explanation of that. And the whole theory broke down in connection. His theory implied that, let us say, the value of a 30-year-old bottle of scotch should be the same as a 1-year-old bottle, because they both have the same labor. But there are all kinds of cases where you can show that goods with the same labor content have a permanent difference in value. And Ricardo really laid these all out, and von Bobert developed them, and that's the substance of von Bobert's book, Karl Marx and the Close of His System. Then Marx tried to claim, his last-ditch defense was, well, on the average, goods exchange in accordance with the quantity of labor. There are cases where they exchange for more than in proportion to the labor, but equally as many in which they exchange for less than in proportion to the quantity of labor. And Volvacher replied, but on that basis we could say that goods exchange in proportion to their specific gravity or atomic numbers, because we always have so many positives and negatives. And that case, that Marxism has been dislodged from the economic theory in the Western world. There are very few, there are no Marxists, Marxists who have any prestige in economics in the Western world since that time.
This gentleman.
Was Marx lionized by others than Engels? He had enjoyed some kind of social acceptance among a certain class?
Well, of course, the radical working men and everyday socialists thought of Marx as the guy who had the theory. This is a very important thing. If you have a well-established, apparently consistent theory which explains what somebody wants to be true, you have it made, so to speak. And of course you are lionized. Of course you are regarded as the prophet, so to speak. P-R-O-P-H-E-T. The gentleman in the red shirt.
Could you explain again how Marx is trying to stay on the perceptual level in his theory of value, other than that all labor is physical? There was some other aspect to his attempting to remain on the perceptual level.
Well, I know a person. Will I explain? The question is, will I explain how Marx stayed on the perceptual level in his theory of value, other than merely in emphasizing manual labor over skilled labor? Is that right? Or rather, unskilled over skilled? Well, another example would be the demand which some people make today that the worker be allowed to make the whole product. The auto worker make the whole automobile so that he can see every bit of it and gain that satisfaction at having produced the whole product. And this is non-alienated labor, whereas the other is alienated labor. You know, Charlie Caplan was a Marxist, as you know. Have any of you ever seen the old film Modern Times? Remember how he was really alienated. He was in the factory and he had this great big pair of pliers, and a nut would go by every couple of minutes, and he'd have to tighten the nut. And the guy just stood there getting more and more alienated. And he rushed out on the street with this big pair of pliers. And he rushed down the street, and a young lady came along with a nice square buckle on her belt. And so he went up and he went like that to her as she passed. And then, now here, get this second piece of Marxist propaganda. As he ran down the street, suddenly a truck passed him, and the truck had a long pole sticking out the back with a danger flag on the end. And the flag fell off the truck. And Charlie Caplan, in his altruism, reached down and picked up the red flag and began waving it after the truck to try to attract the attention of the driver. Meanwhile, a bunch of revolutionaries came around the corner behind him, and there Charlie was waving the flag. And so he was arrested for a subversion as a result of this. Well, this sort of is the way in which this concept of alienation has entered into the arts. I mean, I got a little bit sidetracked there. Would you go?
I was referring to his theory of value. I believe he said something about when you exchange like shoes for bread, then he sees it as irrational, and I don't know, you said something about the perceptual, he wants to keep it on the perceptual level.
Well, when I make a whole bunch of products, and my intention is not to use these products. Suppose that I make 2,600 pairs of shoes. Now, obviously, if I am staying on the perceptual level, I am not going to enjoy my creativity. I'm not going to enjoy my creativity to the same extent as if I had 52 feet and were able to use all these shoes. Now, so far as the value is concerned, the use value would be what would accrue to me if I could use all these shoes. The exchange value is merely the fact that I am producing this for commodity transactions. The exchange value is therefore something which requires thought, that I have to rise above the perceptual level in order to figure out that other people besides myself are going to need shoes. And so, but when I do rise above this perceptual level, I get alienated. And so it's an agony to rise above the perceptual level. Yes.
Who edited Capital 2 and 3 that were done many years after Marx death?
Well, Engels. The question is, in the case of Volume 2 and Volume 3 of Capital that were done many years after Marx's death, who edited them? Now, Engels edited Volume 2, and I can't remember at the moment who edited Volume 3, but Volume 3 came out just 1 year, I think, after Engels' death. Do you happen to remember, Dr. Eastman, who edited the 3rd volume of Capital?
I think it was Engels, and a few years ago they even compiled a 4th volume in Russia, edited by unknown contemporaries.
Why did Engels support Karl Popper like Karl Marx so many years?
That's what was the motive for his...
Engels supporting
Marx, Engels was committed to the basic theory of revolutionary socialism. He was convinced that Marx was the guy who was able to think it out. He himself was a much better writer than Marx, but he saw that Marx had the greater power of abstraction. And therefore, because of this, he took the position number 2 and kept supporting him. He got very angry with him sometimes. Once he reported to him that the lady, he sent a letter to Marx saying that the lady that he, Engels, was living with had just died. And Marx wrote back, "Too bad, can you send me some more money?" And this caused a rift of about 2 weeks between them. Any more questions? Yes.
How did Marx's wife get after all the politics?
She didn't focus. That's really the truth. I mean, she just did not see. She wrote, as a matter of fact, she wrote a little autobiography in which she told about all the misery that she had gotten into since she had married Marx. The Soviets edited this thing, and they took out all the juicier pages, so we don't know really what other facts there are here. Yes.
It seems to me like that there are a lot of psychological confessions of Marx in here. For example, it could have been that he was speaking for himself when he said that raising above his own perceptual level alienated him. Can you comment on that and perhaps bring in some other things that you've observed?
Well, could I comment upon the fact that Marx had said that he was staying on the perceptual level?
No. That it could have been a psychological confession of him, of his own, that he brought into his philosophy. For example, that raising above the perceptual level could have alienated him, actually, instead of...
Well, it alienated him to have to work for a living. That's what alienated him. He wanted to be having his strange idea of fun all the time. Just let me give you one example of his idea of fun. He once went on a long pub crawl Now, this is a real, honest-to-goodness pub crawl where you drink as much as you can in every place where you stop, from one end of London to another. And every pub that he went into, he started denouncing the British workers for their inferiority to German workers, denouncing English culture for its inferiority to German culture. And as he would go from one pub to another, he would throw stones and break the street lights all along the way. Really the only property that Marx actually physically destroyed was public property, which is very strange for a socialist. One more question. Yes, Linda.
I'm a little confused about that term dialectical materialism. Exactly how did he use it? Did he mean that his idea of a dialogue is fight?
I don't think I used that term so far. Dialectical materialism was a term thought up by a Russian Marxist philosopher named Plekhanov to refer to Engels' system and not to Marx's. But it is important and it's implicit in Marx, and I'd like to reserve it until the next lecture. Okay? Thank you.